The HOA president had my husband's truck towed at 3 in the morning, so I used public records to expose his illegal backyard oasis and watched the county bulldoze it to the ground. 6 in the morning, empty driveway. I stood in the doorway in my socks, staring at the wet concrete where Grant's truck should have been. My first thought was theft. My chest went tight. I almost called the police right there in my pajamas. Then I saw it. An orange sticker slapped crooked across our front door, right at eye level. Notice of towed vehicle. Fawn Brook Estates Homeowners Association. I read it twice before it made sense. Foster had it towed. At 3 in the morning, while we slept. Foster Talmadge, our HOA president. The man who drove his golf cart up and down Larkspur Court every evening at 6, measuring grass with his eyes, hunting for a garbage can left out an hour too long. Grant is an electrician. Owns his company outright, Merrick Electric, has for 6 years. His van carries no ladder rack, no rooftop signage, nothing that screams commercial. He peels the magnetic door decals off every single night before he even pulls into our driveway. Legally, under our own HOA bylaws, that makes it a personal vehicle. Foster never cared what the bylaws said. He cared what he felt like enforcing. I walked out to the street in my pajama pants and bare feet, coffee mug still in my hand, and marched straight to his house at the end of the cul-de-sac. He was already out front, hose in hand, watering flowers that didn't need watering at 6 in the morning, like he'd been waiting for me. "Foster," I said, and my voice cracked with how tired and furious I was. "That's illegal. You had no right." He didn't even turn the hose off. "Rules are rules, sweetheart." A little shrug, like he was doing me a favor by explaining it slowly. "Maybe your husband should get a real job, one that doesn't require parking an eyesore in a residential driveway." I stood there in the wet grass, humiliated, while 2 doors down Mrs. Okafor watered her own lawn and very deliberately did not look at us. I could feel my face burning. I called the lot before we even had coffee in us, my hand still not steady on the phone. The man on the other end read off a case number like he'd said it 1,000 times that week and told us to bring cash. Exact change, no exceptions. Grant stood in the kitchen doorway in yesterday's shirt, jaw tight, not saying much, which for him is worse than shouting. He's not a man who raises his voice. He goes quiet instead, and that morning he was quieter than I'd ever seen him. We drove 40 minutes to the impound lot that afternoon, out past the county line where the road turns to cracked asphalt and chain link. It smelled like diesel and old rubber the second we got out of the car. $650, cash only, no cards accepted, a hand-lettered sign taped to bulletproof glass like it had been there since the lot opened. Grant counted out bills at the counter while a fluorescent light buzzed overhead, and I watched his shoulders drop half an inch with every 20 he handed over. Grant missed an entire morning of work, an electrical panel job in Brighton Wood he'd been scheduled for since March, a client he'd never get in front of again if he canceled twice. $800 in lost wages, gone, because a man in a golf cart decided our driveway offended him. We didn't talk much on the drive home. Grant kept both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road, and somewhere around the county line he said quietly, "20 years I've had my own trucks parked in driveways. Never had this happen once." I didn't have an answer for that. I just watched the fields go by and felt the anger settle into something colder and more permanent than it had been that morning. That evening I watched Foster from our kitchen window. He was out on his lawn again, dragging a hose across the grass, humming something to himself. He caught us pulling back into our own driveway and lifted one hand in a small, tight wave, smug, like he'd already won something. He had no idea what I actually do for a living. I've spent 9 years as a title examiner at Callaway Title and Escrow. My entire job is public records, deeds, easements, permits, liens, plat maps, the invisible paper skeleton underneath every property in this county. I know how to find things people don't want found. And that night, standing at our kitchen counter with my laptop open and my hands still shaking with anger, I decided I was going to find something on Foster Talmadge. I didn't know yet how far it would go. I didn't know it would end with 2 county trucks in his driveway, or a demolition crew tearing his backyard apart board by board, or a man crouched in the dark beside my car with a pair of pliers in his hand. That night, I just wanted to breathe again. I wanted to stop feeling small in front of my own house. So I opened the county's GIS mapping portal and started looking. To understand how we got there, you have to understand how things used to be, and how a person like Foster Talmadge gets to run a neighborhood like it's his personal kingdom. I'm 34, Grant is 37. We bought our house on Larkspur Court 4 years ago, a 3-bedroom colonial with good bones and a crooked porch light we never got around to fixing, in a development called Fawn Brook Estates, 20 minutes outside the county seat in Callaway County. It was the kind of neighborhood real estate listings describe as established, mature trees, sidewalks that had actually cracked with age instead of looking manufactured, a shared clubhouse with a pool nobody used past Labor Day. We loved it immediately. 51 homes, 1 HOA, dues of $85 a month that mostly went toward mowing the common areas and keeping the pool chlorinated. For our first 2 years there, the HOA president was a retired school teacher named Walt Sorensen. Walt ran things the way you'd want a neighborhood run. If your grass got a little long during a heat wave, he'd mention it to you at the mailbox, not mail you a citation. If a kid's basketball hoop rolled a little too close to the curb, he'd help you drag it back rather than photograph it for a violation file. People genuinely liked living under Walt. I remember him standing in our driveway the week we moved in, welcoming us with a plate of his wife's lemon bars, telling us if we ever needed anything to just knock. He kept the HOA newsletter to a single page, mostly pool hours, and a reminder about the fall leaf pickup, and he ran meetings that lasted 20 minutes because nobody had much to complain about. Foster Talmadge moved on to Larkspur Court about a year after we did, into the big house at the end of the cul-de-sac with the wraparound driveway. He and his wife Linda seemed pleasant enough at first. We went to their Memorial Day barbecue that first summer, ate Foster's overcooked burgers, admired Linda's dahlias, the two of them working the yard together like a matched set, Foster manning the grill in an apron that said, "Kiss the cook," while Linda refilled drinks and laughed a little too hard at his jokes. Foster worked in commercial insurance underwriting, the kind of job that made him talk about risk exposure and liability at a backyard cookout like it was normal conversation. He cornered Grant near the cooler that afternoon and spent 10 minutes explaining why homeowners' policies were a scam if you didn't read the exclusions, and I remember catching Grant's eye over Foster's shoulder, both of us trying not to laugh. He struck me as uptight but harmless. Grant thought he was a little full of himself, the way he corrected people's grilling technique unprompted, telling Mr. Dietrich he was flipping his burgers too early, but nothing that raised alarms. Linda pulled me aside near the dahlias that day and told me quietly that Foster had wanted to run for president of his last HOA two towns over, before a job transfer moved them here. He likes having a project, she said, and I remember thinking it was a strange, small thing to say about a person, the kind of comment that only makes sense in hindsight. Then, 2 springs ago, Walt Sorensen stepped down, health reasons officially. Unofficially, I heard from Priya Anand, our HOA treasurer and one of the few board members I actually trusted, that Foster had spent the better part of a year lobbying quietly against Walt, needling other board members about lax enforcement and declining property values, until Walt got tired of the fight and let it go. Foster ran unopposed for president. Nobody else wanted the headache. Within 3 months, Fawnbrook Estates felt like a different neighborhood. The newsletter went from 1 page to 4, dense with subsections, and cross-referenced bylaw numbers nobody had bothered to read in a decade. Foster started walking the streets himself on Sunday evenings with a tape measure and a phone camera, building what he called, in one email, a baseline compliance record for every property on Larkspur Court. Foster mailed the Ramos family a $500 fine because their son's portable basketball hoop sat 11 inches over the property line marked in the bylaws, a rule nobody had ever measured before, let alone enforced, on a hoop that had sat in that exact spot for 3 years without complaint. He wrote up the Okafors for leaving their garbage bins visible from the street 2 hours past the posted pickup window, a violation he documented with a time-stamped photo he'd apparently taken on his morning walk. He had Mr. Dietrich's camper towed from his own driveway for being present for more than the permitted 72 consecutive hours, even though Dietrich had documentation showing it was there for a single weekend to load fishing gear, receipts from the marina and everything, which Foster dismissed as not dispositive of parking duration. He fined an elderly widow 2 doors down from us, Mrs. Petrakis, $60 for a wind chime he decided qualified as an unapproved yard ornament, and when she showed up to the next meeting in tears, he told the board it set a precedent worth protecting and declined to waive it. I remember Priya telling me afterward in the parking lot that she'd voted against it and lost 3-2 because 2 of the other board members had simply stopped showing up to disagree with Foster by then. It was easier, she said, to let him run the meetings the way he wanted and just not fight every battle. I should have seen it as a warning. I didn't. Not fully. Not until it landed on us. There was one incident, about a year and a half before Grant's truck disappeared, that I think about now as the moment that explained everything, if I'd only known how to read it. Foster started construction on his backyard. A big project. You could hear the concrete mixers from 3 houses down some Saturdays. He posted about it constantly in the Fawnbrook community Facebook group. Dozens of photos. A running diary of his backyard oasis, as he called it. A stacked stone patio. A built-in outdoor kitchen with a stainless grill and a pizza oven. A retaining wall he was especially proud of because he'd built it himself over 2 summers, mostly solo, to save 15 grand versus hiring it out. He posted videos of himself setting the stone, time-stamped, dated, bragging in the captions about doing it all the right way, no shortcuts. At the time, I liked the posts. I even commented on one, told him it looked great. I had no idea I was watching a man document his own future undoing in real time. One smug caption after another. That was the Foster we knew before the tow. Rigid, self-satisfied, convinced that rules existed for other people to follow and for him to interpret. I didn't hate him yet. I was just tired of him, the way you get tired of a mosquito that keeps landing on your arm. Grant used to joke, driving home from a long job, that Foster probably measured his own grass with a ruler before he mowed it, just to make sure he was cutting exactly a third off the top like the lawn care blogs recommended. I laughed along every time. It never once occurred to either of us that the same rigid precision might be hiding something instead of simply being who he was. It took the truck and the impound lot and that tight little wave across our lawn to turn my exhaustion into something else entirely. I went to Foster's house again 2 days after the tow, this time during daylight, this time with Grant beside me and a printed copy of our HOA bylaws in my hand, page 14 highlighted. The section defining a commercial vehicle by visible signage and rooftop equipment. Grant's van met neither condition. Foster read it standing in his doorway, arms crossed, Linda hovering somewhere behind him in the hallway. He handed it back to me without really looking at it. "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention," he said, in the flat, rehearsed voice of a man reading from a script only he could hear. But I have to consider the whole neighborhood's property values, not just your family's convenience. There's nothing in here that supports towing his truck, I said. You didn't even give us a warning. I gave a courtesy notice. He hadn't. You must have missed it. That was the first time I understood I wasn't dealing with a man who'd made a mistake. I was dealing with a man who was going to insist, calmly and endlessly, that the version of events he preferred was the one that had happened. I emailed the board that night, all 5 members, laying out the bylaw language, asking for a formal review of the towing decision and reimbursement for the impound fee and Grant's lost wages. Foster, as president, was the one who replied. He thanked me for my passion, said he'd bring it to the next meeting, and reminded the whole board, CC'd, that isolated grievances shouldn't distract us from bigger community priorities. Nothing came of it. 3 weeks passed. No meeting was scheduled. When I followed up, I got a single line back. The board has reviewed your concern and determined the tow was compliant with association policy. I called Priya directly after that email, hoping for something more human than a form response, and she admitted carefully that there hadn't been a formal review at all. Foster had simply told the other members it was handled and moved the agenda along. He does that, she said, decides something, tells us it's settled, and by the time anyone thinks to push back, we're 2 items further down the agenda. I asked her why nobody just said something in the room. She was quiet for a second. Because the last person who pushed back hard, he found a violation on their property within a month. Nobody wants to be next. I should have taken that as the warning it was. Instead, I told myself we were different, that we had the facts on our side, that a man couldn't just manufacture a problem out of nothing to punish someone for asking a reasonable question. Then, the following Tuesday, we got a citation in the mail. Our mailbox, Foster's letter explained, was painted a shade of navy that did not conform to the association's approved exterior color palette. Ours had been that color for 4 years, the same shade as half the mailboxes on the street, chosen off a paint swatch Walt Sorensen himself had approved back when we moved in. Nobody had ever mentioned it since. The fine was $75, due within 30 days, or it would compound. Grant wanted to march down there that night and say something he'd regret. I talked him out of it, mostly because I didn't trust myself not to say something worse. I stood in our kitchen holding that letter and felt something in me go very quiet and very clear. This wasn't a dispute anymore. This was a pattern, and patterns can be documented, and documentation was the one thing in the entire world I actually knew how to do better than Foster Talmadge. I opened the county's GIS portal that same night, the same public mapping system I use every week at work to check parcel boundaries and recorded easements before a title closes. I typed in Foster's address out of pure spite, honestly, at first. I wanted to see his lot lines. I wanted to see if there was anything at all, that a man that particular about a mailbox color might have gotten wrong on his own property. It took less than 10 minutes to find it. A recorded drainage easement ran across the rear 20 feet of Foster's lot, a corridor granted to the county decades ago, back when Fawnbrook Estates was platted, to manage stormwater runoff from 3 surrounding streets during heavy rain. It was marked clearly on the plat map, the kind of easement that shows up in black and white the moment you know where to look. Nobody can build on it. Not a shed, not a fence post, nothing permanent, without a variance that gets denied about as often as it gets granted. I pulled up satellite imagery next and laid it over the parcel lines. Foster's retaining wall, the one he'd bragged about for 2 summers, the one he'd built himself to save $15,000, sat almost entirely inside that easement. So did roughly a third of his outdoor kitchen. My hands went a little cold on the keyboard. I told myself to slow down, to check this properly instead of running on adrenaline and spite. So I did what I'd do for any client at work. I pulled the county's permit database next, searched Foster's address, and waited. Nothing came up. No permit for the retaining wall. No permit for the gas line running to his grill. No electrical permit for the outdoor lighting he'd bragged about, wiring himself in one of his Facebook posts. The same kind of unlicensed work that could get Grant's business shut down in a week if he ever pulled it on a client's property. Foster had built his entire backyard oasis without a single piece of paperwork, on land the county had never actually given him the right to touch. I didn't say anything to Grant that night. I wanted to be sure. So the next morning, I called a licensed surveyor, a heavyset, unhurried man named Marcus Whitlock who'd done work for our title company before, and paid him $450 out of our own pocket to come stake Foster's rear property line properly, with instruments, not satellite guesswork. He called me the following afternoon. "You were right to double-check," he said. "The wall crosses the easement line by right around 8 feet. And that kitchen structure. The concrete pad extends across it too, about 6 feet at the widest point." He paused. "Whoever built that either didn't know the easement was there or knew and didn't care." I already had a good guess which one it was. I brought the survey to the next scheduled HOA meeting, along with the blank permit search and printouts of Foster's own bragging Facebook posts, dated, with his own captions describing exactly what he'd built and when. I thought presenting it to the board, in the room, might finally force some accountability, since I still half believed the other 4 members were reasonable people being steered by one loud one. Grant offered to come with me. I told him to stay home. I didn't want this to look like 2 against 1, and honestly, some stubborn part of me wanted to be the one to lay it all out myself, calm and factual, the way I'd walk a client through a title defect. I was wrong about how that room would go. Foster stood up before I'd even finished laying my documents on the table. His voice cracked, just slightly, in a way I'd never heard from him before. more. I think it's important everyone understand what's actually happening here, he said, looking around at the other homeowners in the folding chairs. Not at me. This is a personal vendetta. Ever since the tow, this family has been trying to destroy my reputation in this community. He gestured vaguely at Linda, sitting in the second row with her hands folded tight in her lap. My wife has been having panic attacks over this. Genuine panic attacks. Is that really what any of you want? To watch a neighbor's marriage fall apart over a parking dispute? I tried to answer. Tried to point out that I hadn't said a word about his marriage, that I was talking about a stormwater easement recorded in the county's own plat map since before either of us lived here. He talked over me louder, about the stress of public service, about how he'd given hundreds of unpaid hours to protect everyone's property values, about how it was easy to criticize from the sidelines when you'd never had to make the hard calls yourself. It was the first time I understood how good he actually was at this. Not at governing, but at performing the wounded party so convincingly that the facts in my hands started to feel, in that room, like they were somehow the unreasonable thing. 2 board members actually nodded along with him. One elderly homeowner, Mr. Halloran, patted Linda's shoulder on his way out, murmuring something about how some people just can't let things go. Nobody asked to actually see the survey. Nobody asked why a licensed surveyor's report and a blank county permit search would exist if I'd simply invented a grievance out of spite. I sat there with a licensed survey in my hands, real, documented, undeniable, and watched a room full of my neighbors decide that my quiet, factual complaint was somehow the aggressive act, because Foster had learned to cry vendetta faster than I could say easement. I drove home that night more shaken than angry, replaying it, wondering if I'd somehow mishandled it, if I'd come across harsher than I meant to. It took Grant, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with the survey spread out between us, to say the thing I needed to hear. You didn't do anything wrong in there, he said. He just talks faster than the truth does. The board tabled the issue, pending further review. Nothing was scheduled. A week later, a new citation arrived. Our garbage bins had apparently been visible from the street 40 minutes past the allowed window on trash day. $75 again. This one marked, second offense, penalties may escalate. Around the same time, a post went up in the Fawn Brook Community Facebook group, the same group Foster had once used to brag about his stonework, this time warning neighbors, without naming us directly, to verify licensing and insurance before hiring any contractors currently residing within the association, and to consider whether a vendor's personal conduct reflects the standards we expect in this community. Everyone on that street knew exactly who he meant. Grant had wired half the houses in Fawn Brook Estates himself over the years, side jobs for neighbors who trusted him precisely because he lived among them. 2 of those neighbors quietly canceled scheduled work that week, mumbling vague excuses over text. I watched a man use a community Grant had helped build, literally, wire by wire, to try to starve out his business. And I understood then that Foster wasn't just protecting his authority. He was willing to take food off our table to keep it. I paid it. I didn't want to give him an opening, but paying it did something else, something I didn't expect. It made me curious, in a very specific, professional way, about where exactly all these $75 checks were actually going. Homeowners in Callaway County are entitled, by state statute, to request a full accounting of their association's finances once per fiscal year. I knew the law because I'd used it myself for clients disputing HOA liens at closing. So I emailed Priya Anand, our treasurer, and asked for the annual financial disclosure. Every homeowner's right, nothing unusual, nothing that should have raised a single eyebrow. Priya sent it over within 2 days, a dense 12-page PDF of line items. I skimmed it that night at the kitchen table, mostly looking for anything explaining where fine money landed. Landscaping, pool maintenance, insurance, a modest legal reserve, and one line, near the bottom of the capital improvement section, that I read, and then set aside without thinking much of it at all. Capital improvement, drainage remediation, common area, $1,400, approved by board resolution. I remember thinking it was strange only in passing. We didn't have any common area drainage work that I'd noticed, but I had bigger, more immediate proof sitting right in front of me. A survey, a blank permit search, dated social media confessions, and I filed that line item away in the back of my mind the way you file away a smell that doesn't quite match the room. Something to come back to, later, if I had time. I didn't wait on the board any longer. I skipped them entirely. Foster ran that room, and I finally understood that going through him meant going nowhere. I drove downtown myself on a Thursday morning. My lunch hour stretched into 2, and walked the survey and photographs into the Callaway County Code Enforcement Office. I handed everything to an inspector named Catherine Boyle, a sharp, unhurried woman who read through the packet twice before saying a word. "This is thorough," she said finally, tapping the surveyor's report. "Most people who come in here have a grudge and no documentation. You have both, but the documentation stands on its own." She asked me a few procedural questions. When the wall was built, whether the homeowner had ever applied for a variance, whether I'd reported it to the HOA first, and I answered each one plainly, without embellishment, the way I'd want a client to answer me at closing. She logged an official complaint and referred the drainage portion to the Regional Water Management Office the same afternoon, telling me the referral alone would trigger an inspection within 2 weeks under the county's stormwater ordinance. I gave the same packet, duplicated, to a woman there named Ellen Faust, who spread the survey out across her desk and traced the easement line with one finger before before looking up at me. 8 feet is significant, she said. We've fined people less for 18 inches. She told me easement violations involving stormwater infrastructure moved faster than most code cases because the county carried liability if a blocked drainage corridor caused flooding downstream, and a corridor with a masonry retaining wall sitting across a third of it was exactly the kind of thing that kept engineers up at night during a 100-year storm. I left her office that afternoon feeling, for the first time in weeks, like the facts were finally moving faster than Foster's ability to talk over them. 3 days later, at 10 in the morning on a Wednesday, 2 county trucks rolled slowly onto Larkspur Court and stopped in front of Foster's driveway, engines idling loud enough that I heard them from our kitchen before I saw them. I was on our porch with coffee, not by accident. I'd cleared my morning at work for exactly this possibility, telling my manager only that I had a personal matter to handle. I watched an inspector walk up Foster's front path with a clipboard, while a second official waited by the truck, one hand resting on a stack of laminated notices. Foster answered the door in a golf shirt, still smiling, still certain, the way he always was, that whatever was happening could be talked away with the right tone of voice, the same tone he'd used on me in his own doorway 2 weeks earlier. I watched that certainty leave his face in real time. He read whatever was on that clipboard, and the color went right out of him. He gestured toward his own backyard, once, twice, his voice rising just enough to carry across 2 lawns, but the inspector only nodded politely and kept walking, past him, toward the gate that led to his oasis. I set my coffee down on the porch rail and watched Foster stand in his own driveway, holding a piece of paper he clearly hadn't expected to receive, turning it over like the words might rearrange themselves into something less final on the second read. Whatever came next, I understood, was going to be bigger than a tow, bigger than a mailbox fine, bigger than anything I'd started out looking for. And underneath the satisfaction, some small, careful part of me kept circling back to that one strange line item sitting quietly in a financial disclosure on our kitchen table. $18,400, drainage remediation, common area, waiting for me to understand exactly what it meant. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description, for early access to new stories and better audio quality. Now back to the video. The county gave Foster 14 days. Tear down the retaining wall, the outdoor kitchen, the entire encroaching structure himself, or the county would send its own crew to do it and bill him for every hour, every truck, every disposal fee, at rates that made the whole voluntary option look generous by comparison. He didn't tear it down himself. I don't think even then some part of him believed it was really going to happen. A demolition crew showed up 9 days later, a Tuesday, with a mini excavator and 2 guys running cut-off saws. I sat on our back deck most of that week with a book I never actually read, listening to blade after blade scream through composite decking, through stacked stone, through 2 summers of Foster's proudest work, piece by piece, load after load, hauled out in the beds of county dump trucks. Kids on bikes slowed down at the end of the cul-de-sac to watch the excavator work, the way kids do for any big machine, and a couple of neighbors found excuses to walk their dogs past Foster's house twice a day that week instead of once. Nobody said much out loud. Everyone watched anyway. Foster stopped driving his golf cart down Larkspur Court. He stopped mowing his own lawn on Saturday mornings the way he always had, standing shirtless and sunburned, timing himself against the neighbors. Linda's car left earlier and came home later. Neighbors who used to lift a hand to him at the mailbox started finding reasons to check their phones instead. I should have felt nothing but satisfaction. Mostly I did. But there was a strange, quiet undertow to it too. Something I didn't expect and didn't like admitting to myself. A flicker of guilt at watching a person's pride get bulldozed in real time, even a person who'd earned it. I pushed that feeling down most days. It kept coming back anyway, at odd moments, usually late at night. The demolition finished on a Friday. By the following Monday, Priya called me sounding worried in a way I hadn't heard from her before. He's pushing for a special assessment, she said. An emergency line item, $400 per household, to cover what he's calling unexpected legal and remediation costs from the drainage situation. A pause. He's framing it like the neighborhood owes him something. Like we all caused this. Something in me went cold and very still. Foster wanted us to pay for the consequences of his own illegal construction, on top of everything we'd already been fined. I told Priya I needed the full financial history, not just the annual summary. Every transaction tied to that drainage remediation line, and every invoice behind it. She sent it over that evening, a scanned folder of receipts and vendor invoices going back nearly 2 years, the kind of granular detail most homeowners never bother requesting. I sat at the kitchen table with Grant beside me, and we went through it line by line. The $18,400 wasn't one payment, it was 6, spread across 14 months, each one made out to a vendor called Talmadge Hardscape Solutions, LLC. I opened the state's business registry on my laptop, right there at the table, hands not quite steady anymore. Talmadge Hardscape Solutions, LLC had been incorporated 2 summers ago. The same month Foster's first bragging construction post appeared on the Fawnbrook Community Facebook group. The registered agent was Foster Talmadge. The business address was his own house. There was no other registered business at that address. No history of prior filings. Nothing to suggest this was anything but a name invented for one purpose. Look at the incorporation date again, Grant said, leaning over my shoulder. That's 2 weeks before his first post about breaking ground. I checked it 3 times to be sure I wasn't seeing what I I wanted to see instead of what was actually there. It held up every time. I pulled up his old posts again, the ones I'd once liked and commented on, genuinely admired at the time, and matched them against the invoices one by one, laying printouts side by side across the table like evidence boards in a movie. Except this was our kitchen, and the coffee had gone cold hours ago. Flagstone quantities that matched almost exactly. Square footage of poured concrete, invoice against caption, within a few feet either way. A specific brand of composite decking he'd mentioned by name in a caption, bragging about the price he'd gotten it for. The same brand, the same linear footage, billed to the HOA 11 days later. Every material Foster had used to build his own illegal backyard oasis had been paid for, in full out of the Fawnbrook Estates HOA reserve fund, laundered through a shell company he'd created himself, approved through motions he'd made himself in a room he controlled by sheer force of everyone else's exhaustion. There was more, once I started really looking. Two smaller invoices further back marked erosion control services and landscape buffer maintenance. Another $9,000 combined. Same LLC, same pattern, going back to almost the month he'd taken office. $27,000 total over 2 years, quietly bled out of common reserves that every homeowner on Larkspur Court had paid into, including every $75 fine he'd mailed to families like the Ramoses and the Okafors and us. One line on an early invoice made my stomach turn over entirely. Bookkeeping and administrative support, itemized separately, paid to Linda Talmadge personally. His wife had helped keep the books on the very fund he was quietly draining. I sat back in my chair and looked at Grant, and for a second, neither of us said anything. All those citations, all that righteous language about property values and community standards, and the entire time, the man enforcing it had been stealing from the same neighbors he was fining for garbage bins and grass height to build the one thing he'd never had the money or the right to build, honestly. He fined the Ramoses $500 for a basketball hoop, Grant finally said very quietly, and used our dues to build himself a pizza oven. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about Foster standing in that HOA meeting, voice cracking, gesturing at Linda's panic attacks, calling my documented easement violation a personal vendetta. He hadn't been protecting the neighborhood's property values at all. He'd been protecting a con. I called Priya first thing the next morning before I'd even had coffee and told her everything. She went quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment. I need to see those invoices myself, she finally said. Officially, not as a favor, as treasurer. Under our bylaws, 10% of homeowners could call a special emergency meeting by signed petition, bypassing the president's calendar entirely. 51 homes meant we needed 6 signatures. Priya and I had 4 between us before lunch. Walt Sorensen, the old president, Foster had quietly pushed out 2 years earlier, signed without a single question when I explained what I'd found. A grim, satisfied look settling over his face like he'd been waiting 2 years for exactly this. He read the invoice printouts twice at his own kitchen table, shaking his head slowly, and told me he'd suspected Foster was skimming something, somewhere, from almost the month he took over, but had never had anything solid enough to say so out loud without sounding bitter about losing the presidency. Carla Ramos signed on her porch, the same porch where she'd once handed her son's $500 citation to her husband, and cried about it at the kitchen table, she told me later, because it felt like being punished for the crime of having a kid. Mr. Dietrich signed his name so hard the pen nearly tore through the paper, muttering something under his breath about a camper and 72 hours that I didn't ask him to repeat. We had our 6 signatures by Wednesday afternoon. The meeting was set for the following Monday, 7 o'clock at the clubhouse. Foster tried to control the room the moment we walked in. He stood near the podium instead of sitting with the board, greeting people at the door like it was his event, his rules, his neighborhood, the way he always had. Linda sat in the front row this time instead of the second, her hands folded the same tight way they always were, though something in her face looked more tired than defensive. I let Priya open the meeting formally, since procedure mattered here, and I wanted this to feel like exactly what it was, an official accounting, not a shouting match he could later spin into another story about a vendetta. There's an item requiring the board's immediate attention, Priya said, regarding the Capital Improvement Fund. Foster's expression barely moved. I'm happy to walk everyone through the drainage remediation costs, he said smoothly. Unfortunately, correcting a county infrastructure issue on association-adjacent land isn't cheap. I've absorbed a great deal of personal stress trying to manage this on the board's behalf. It wasn't association-adjacent land, I said, standing up, folder in hand. It was your backyard. I laid the documents out on the table in the order that told the story cleanest. The survey, showing the wall on his own property, 8 feet into a county easement. The blank permit search. His own dated Facebook posts, bragging about building it himself. Then the invoices, 6 payments over 14 months, all to Talmadge Hardscape Solutions, LLC. All matched material for material against his own captions. Then the business registry printout. His name as registered agent. His home address as the company's address. Then the 2 older invoices, erosion control, landscape buffer maintenance, dating back to nearly the day he took office. Talmadge Hardscape Solutions is you, I said, looking at him directly for the first time all night. You approved payments to yourself from money every family on this street paid in to build the exact structure you got fined homeowners for questioning. The room had gone completely silent. I could hear the pool filter humming through the clubhouse wall. Foster's voice, when it came, was thinner than I'd ever never heard it. This is a mischaracterization, he said. The board approved every expenditure. I recused myself from the vote. You didn't, Priya said flatly from beside him at the podium, holding up the meeting minutes she'd pulled herself. You made the motion. Twice. Something in Foster's face finally, completely, gave way. The certainty he'd worn like a uniform for 2 years just wasn't there anymore. He looked, for the first time since I'd known him, like a man who understood the room had stopped believing him. Everything I did, he said, and his voice cracked exactly the way it had at that first meeting, except this time nobody moved to comfort him. Everything was for this community. The value of every single house on this street went up because of what I built back there. You didn't build it for the community, Foster, I said. You built it for yourself, with money that wasn't yours, on land that wasn't yours, and then you fined the rest of us to make it look like discipline. I let that sit in the quiet room for a second before I said the last part, the part I'd been holding since the morning I found that orange sticker on our door. This isn't a vendetta, it's a receipt. Nobody clapped, nobody cheered. It wasn't that kind of room, but I watched Mr. Halloran, who'd patted Linda's shoulder on his way out of the last meeting, look at Foster now with something closer to disgust than sympathy, and I watched Carla Ramos's husband shake his head slowly, and I understood that whatever Foster Talmadge had built in this neighborhood over 2 years, some brittle structure of fear and deference and fines, had just come down as completely as his retaining wall. For a long moment, nobody spoke at all. Then Carla Ramos's husband stood up in the back row, the same man who'd once written a $500 check for his son's basketball hoop without a word of complaint, and asked, quietly but clearly, so the fine you sent us, that money went into the same fund you were paying yourself out of. It wasn't really a question. Foster didn't answer it. He didn't have an answer that wouldn't make things worse. The board voted that same night to suspend Foster's authority pending a full financial audit. Walt Sorensen, of all people, moved the motion, his voice steady in a way that made it clear he'd been waiting 2 years to say the words. It passed unanimously, 5-0, including the 2 members who'd once nodded along with Foster's story about a vendetta, both of them now avoiding his eyes entirely, studying the tabletop like it might explain how they'd gotten this wrong for so long. Linda didn't say a word the entire meeting. I watched her instead, the whole time, the way her hands stayed folded in her lap even as everything around her came apart, the way her face didn't move when the word embezzlement finally got said out loud in a room full of people she had to keep living near. She stood up when it ended, gathered her purse, and walked out ahead of him without waiting, without looking back once to see if he followed. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. The retaliation started small, the way it usually does, the kind of thing you could almost convince yourself was coincidence if you wanted to badly enough. 2 mornings after the emergency meeting, I found screws scattered across our driveway, dozens of them, sharp side up, positioned with a precision that made it obvious they hadn't fallen from anywhere. They sat directly where our front tires would roll first thing in the morning, clustered in a tight arc no wind or accident could have arranged. I swept them up in a dustpan, my hands shaking, and didn't call the police yet. I told myself I needed proof before I made an accusation I couldn't take back. An accusation about a man who, only a week earlier, half the neighborhood had still been willing to defend. Grant wanted to say something to Foster directly. Walk down to the end of the cul-de-sac and put it plainly. I asked him not to. That's exactly what he wants, I told him. Something he can point to and call a threat. Let's not give him the story he needs. Grant hated that answer. He swept the driveway with me instead, jaw tight, not saying much. The same quiet I'd learned by then to recognize as barely contained fury. 2 nights after that, our garbage cans were tipped over in the street, lids gone, trash soaked from an overnight sprinkler and scattered across wet asphalt for the whole cul-de-sac to see the next morning. I stood in my robe at 6 a.m., picking up soggy cereal boxes and coffee grounds while Mrs. Okafor watched from her own porch, this time without pretending not to. She came over eventually, still in her slippers, and helped me chase down a paper towel roll that had unspooled halfway across the street. I know who did this, she said quietly, not really a question. I didn't answer her directly. I didn't have to. I still didn't call the police. I wanted something they couldn't argue away, something with a timestamp and a face attached to it. So I went up into our attic that weekend and ran cable myself for 4 cameras, real ones, with motion alerts and night vision sharp enough to read a face from 50 feet in the dark, mounting one under each eave and angling the 4th down the length of the driveway itself. I didn't tell Grant right away, not because I was hiding it, but because some stubborn part of me wanted proof in hand before I said the sentence out loud. I think Foster is coming onto our property at night. It felt like an accusation too large to make without something to back it up. I just started checking the feed on my phone every night before bed, half hoping I was being paranoid, half certain I wasn't, scrolling through hours of nothing but wind moving the trees and the occasional cat crossing the lawn. 3 nights later, at 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed hard against the nightstand. Motion detected, driveway camera. I opened the feed with my thumb shaking. A figure crouched low beside our front tire. Dark hoodie pulled up, stocky build, moving with a familiar, careful economy I would have recognized anywhere on that street, hoodie or not. He pulled something from his jacket pocket. Pliers. I watched him grip the valve stem and twist. The tire started hissing almost immediately, sinking flat onto the rim right there on the screen in front of me. He straightened up and turned his face, just slightly, toward the streetlight at the end of our driveway. Foster. I would have known that walk blindfolded. My thumb hovered over the call button, ready to dial the police right then, my whole body cold with something between fury and disbelief. Before I could press it, he moved toward the second tire, crouched low again, and looked straight up, directly into the camera lens mounted under our eave, like some part of him already knew exactly where I'd hidden it. I called the police that time. Grant was awake before I'd even finished dialing, standing at the window in a t-shirt and boxers, watching the empty driveway like Foster might still be crouched out there in the dark. Officer Diaz arrived within 20 minutes, walked the driveway with a flashlight, photographed both flattened tires from 3 angles each, and watched the footage on my phone 3 separate times before he said a word, pausing it on the frame where Foster's face turned toward the streetlight. "That's about as clean as this kind of thing gets," he said finally. Face, timestamp, deliberate act, second incident logged onto a documented pattern of harassment stemming from an active HOA dispute. "We'll be following up with him tonight." He asked if we wanted to pursue a restraining order alongside the criminal complaint. I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. Grant stood behind me the whole time, arms crossed, saying almost nothing, watching the flattened tires like he was memorizing them for later, and I understood, without either of us saying it out loud, that some part of this had stopped being about property values or bylaws a long time ago. It had become simply about whether we were safe in our own driveway at 2 in the morning, and neither of us was willing to pretend that question away any longer. They did. I watched from our front window as a patrol car pulled into Foster's driveway a little after 3, the same hour, almost to the minute, that his own golf cart had once idled outside our house waiting for a tow truck. Grant stood beside me with his arm around my shoulders, and neither of us said much of anything. There wasn't a version of satisfaction big enough to fill the space where our old, easy neighborhood used to be. The criminal mischief charge was only the beginning of what came apart after that. Foster was arraigned 2 weeks later on the vandalism, released on his own recognizance, a court date set for the fall. He hired a defense attorney out of the county seat, a heavy-set man in a gray suit who showed up to the arraignment and requested a continuance, which the judge granted without much comment. I sat in the back row of that courtroom on a Tuesday morning I'd taken off work for, watching Foster in a blazer instead of a golf shirt, and felt none of the satisfaction I'd expected, just a tired kind of relief that the process, slow as it was finally grinding forward on its own. The HOA's financial audit, run by an outside forensic accountant Priya hired with board approval, confirmed everything I'd found, and then some. The $27,000 in diverted funds, plus another $6,000 in smaller, harder-to-trace reimbursements for administrative expenses that trace back to Talmadge family credit cards, gas station charges, and hardware store runs folded quietly into the reserve fund over 2 years. The accountant's report ran to 40 pages, footnoted and dated, and Priya read the summary aloud at the next board meeting in a flat, careful voice, the way you'd read a verdict. The board voted to pursue civil restitution, 5-0. The county attorney's office opened its own inquiry into potential embezzlement, since HOA reserve funds, once commingled with fraudulent invoicing across state lines through an LLC, crossed into territory well beyond a neighborhood dispute. An investigator called me twice that fall, wanting to walk through the timeline of how I'd found the drainage easement, then the ledger, then the LLC, and I found myself oddly grateful for 9 years of title work every time I answered a question and already knew exactly which document she meant. Linda moved out before the fall court date. I heard it from Priya, who heard it from Mr. Halloran, who'd apparently become the unofficial town crier of Larkspur Court by that point. She took a rental across the county, filed for a legal separation within the month, and stopped posting in the community group entirely, her old comments and photos slowly disappearing from Foster's old threads one by one, like she was quietly erasing herself from a life that had turned out to be built on the same shaky ground as his retaining wall. I ran into her once at the grocery store that fall, both of us reaching for the same brand of coffee, and for a second neither of us knew what to say. She looked smaller than I remembered from that first Memorial Day barbecue. The woman who'd handed me a paper plate and asked if I wanted extra pickles, her cart half empty, a single frozen dinner, and a bag of apples sitting in the child's seat like an afterthought. "I didn't know," she said quietly, not quite looking at me, "about the LLC. I did the books he gave me. I never saw the source accounts." I believed her mostly, though I understood I might never know for certain how much she'd chosen not to see. "I'm sorry," I told her, and meant it, in the strange, complicated way you can mean it for someone whose husband tried to destroy your peace, and whose own life had just been quietly detonated by the same man. She nodded once and pushed her cart toward the registers, and I never saw her again after that, though I heard secondhand, months later, that she'd moved out of state entirely. Not everyone on Larkspur Court sided with us right away, even after the audit went public. A handful of neighbors, mostly people Foster had never fined, mostly people who'd liked the tidy, disciplined feel of the neighborhood under his rule, grumbled for a while that the whole thing had gotten blown out of proportion, that a man shouldn't lose everything over a backyard project. One of them, a retired engineer named Phil Aldis, who lived 2 streets over and rarely came to meetings, cornered me at the mailbox and told me I should have handled it privately, neighbor to neighbor, as if a stormwater easement and an embezzled reserve fund were the kind of thing you settled with a handshake over the fence. I told him, as evenly as I could manage, that I'd tried that first, at 6 in the morning, in my pajamas, and been told my husband should get a real job. He didn't have much to say after that. I understood, in a distant way, why some people preferred a comfortable story to an uncomfortable one. phone. It didn't make it easier to hear. What surprised me more was who did stand with us. Walt Sorensen showed up at every subsequent meeting, quietly providing 2 years of institutional memory nobody else on the board had. The pattern of citations, the timeline of Foster's rise, small details that helped the forensic accountant connect dates and amounts faster than she could have alone. He told me once, over coffee at his kitchen table, that he'd suspected something was off about the drainage line item when it first appeared on a summary 2 years back, but hadn't had the standing anymore, or the proof to push it. "I'm glad someone finally had both," he said. Carla Ramos organized a modest fund among a dozen families to help cover our impound and legal costs, dropping envelopes in our mailbox with no note attached, an act of neighborly generosity that felt, honestly, like the version of Fawnbrook Estates I'd fallen in love with 4 years earlier, quietly reasserting itself one folded 20 at a time. I found myself grieving something I hadn't expected to grieve. Some nights, lying awake after Grant had fallen asleep. Not Foster, not really, but the version of this street I'd believed in before all of it. The barbecues, the lemon bars, the easy wave across a lawn that used to mean something other than a threat. I thought sometimes about Linda in the dahlias that first summer, asking if I wanted extra pickles, and how neither of us could have guessed what the next 2 years would cost us both in entirely different currencies. Some of that was gone for good, replaced by cameras on our eaves and a wariness I still catch myself carrying months later when a stranger's car idles too long at the end of our cul-de-sac. I don't think that feeling ever fully goes away. I've made a kind of peace with carrying it anyway. Foster put the house on Larkspur Court up for sale before winter, once it became clear the civil judgment would attach as a lien if he didn't liquidate first. A moving truck sat in his driveway for 2 full days that October, and I'll admit I watched more of it than I probably should have, from behind our own kitchen curtain, half expecting him to walk over one last time with some parting shot. He never did. He loaded boxes in silence, alone. No golf cart, no clipboard, no hose running over flowers nobody was left to water. The house sold in November to a young couple with a toddler, who I understand from Priya have already asked very politely whether the HOA has any issue with a work van parked in a driveway. The board's answer, under our new bylaws, took about 4 seconds to give. No issue at all, as long as it's registered to the resident. We rewrote that language ourselves, Priya and Walt and I, the spring after the audit, specifically so no future president could ever again decide, on a whim, whose vehicle counted as an eyesore, and specifically so no single officer could approve a capital expenditure without 2 other signatures, a rule Priya insisted on adding herself, quietly, without needing to explain why. Foster's restitution case settled that winter too, a payment plan spread across 5 years, the county foregoing further criminal charges beyond the vandalism conviction in exchange for full cooperation and repayment. The forensic accountant's final figure, once every hardware receipt and disguised reimbursement was tallied, came to just under $34,000. I don't know exactly where he lives now. I've stopped wanting to know. It's been almost a year since that first morning, since I stood in wet grass in my pajamas and watched a man water flowers that didn't need it while my husband's truck sat impounded 40 minutes away. Grant parks in our driveway every night now, van decals peeled off out of habit more than necessity, and nobody photographs it. Nobody measures it against a rulebook designed to be enforced selectively. Priya is our HOA president now, unanimously elected, and the meetings run about 20 minutes and end with actual lemon bars, which Walt's wife still makes because some good things in this neighborhood came back exactly the way they were. I still work the same job, still spend my days buried in plat maps and recorded easements for people who will never know how personally I take that work now. Sometimes a junior examiner at the office will complain about how tedious it is, cross-referencing decades-old survey lines against a modern parcel, and I'll think about telling them what a tedious cross-reference cost one man his marriage, his reputation, and every stone of a backyard he built with his own hands. I usually don't. Some stories only make sense to the person who lived them. I think about that $18,000 line item sometimes, the one I almost overlooked entirely on a kitchen table a year ago, filed away as a strange smell in a room I wasn't ready to search yet. I think about how close I came to letting it go, satisfied with the easement violation alone, the wall, the demolition, the clean and simple justice of watching the county bulldoze an illegal patio into rubble. That would have been enough of a story on its own, enough to tell at a dinner party, enough to make people laugh at the absurdity of a man undone by his own bragging Facebook posts. It wasn't the whole truth, though, and the whole truth mattered more than the satisfying version, even when the satisfying version was so much easier to sit with. That's the thing nobody tells you about people like Foster Talmadge. The petty tyranny is never really about the rule. It's about the power the rule gives someone to decide who gets to feel safe in their own driveway and who doesn't. He fined a family for a basketball hoop and used the money to build himself a pizza oven. He towed my husband's truck at 3 in the morning because he could, and I found out, eventually, that everything he ever punished us for was cover for something he was doing far worse, in the dark, with keys he was never supposed to have. I don't feel triumphant when I tell this story now, not the way I thought I would that first county truck morning, coffee in hand, watching the color drain out of his face. Mostly I feel something quieter, something closer to relief mixed with a small, persistent sadness for the neighborhood we don't quite have anymore, and for a version of Linda who handed me a paper plate once and asked if I wanted extra pickles, and for the 2 years years we spent believing a man's confidence was the same thing as his honesty. People ask me sometimes when they hear the short version of this story whether I regret how far I took it. Whether a towed truck really justified an audit, a demolition, a man's marriage and business and reputation coming apart in the same year. I've turned that question over more times than I can count, usually late at night, usually when I can't sleep. The truth is, I didn't take it that far. He did. Every escalation, every fine, every screw scattered across our driveway, and every valve stem twisted open in the dark was a choice he made, one after another, certain each time that his certainty alone would be enough to make it disappear. I just kept a record. That's all a title examiner really does, in the end. I keep a record of what's actually there, underneath what people would prefer you to believe. The county bulldozed his oasis to the ground that spring. Every stone, every board, hauled off in the beds of dump trucks while I watched from my own porch with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands. I used to think that image was the ending of this story. Now I know it was only the middle. The part where I still believed the worst thing Foster Talmadge had done was build a wall on land that wasn't his. The real ending came later, quieter, in a stack of invoices at my own kitchen table, in the particular silence of a room full of neighbors finally hearing the truth at the same time. That's the part I carry with me now, driving past his old house some evenings, watching a stranger's porch light flicker on at dusk. Not the bulldozer, the paperwork, the proof that even the loudest rules can hide the quietest theft if nobody ever thinks to look.